Entangled life, the mergence with the flesh of God, to reconnect with the unlost instinct.
I originally wrote about the system of sensing in a book called Autism and Sensing the Unlost Instinct, which was published in 1995. We all begin in that system of sensing, a world before mind, where we have a preconscious state that is a state of beingness rather than up there in mind and conscious awareness. And we're yet to accumulate that world of meaning, that dictionary, which then changes how we experience the world. We start to experience it with interpretation, with interpreting rather than sensing it. And then after that, we gain all the indoctrination and inheritance of culture and ego, etc., and all the cladding. And then that changes how mind experiences it. And so it's a progressive level of change in how we experience the world. But as a person who grew up meaning deaf and meaning blind, I retained a lot of that early capacity to navigate my world by pattern and theme and feel. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that system is, how we've all come from it, how some people lose it, and why it's a good thing to get it back. So the system of sensing is our first world. And in our first world, we're really in our own world. It's this place where we accumulate huge amounts of experiences, sensory experiences, emotional waves, tones, movement, textures, smells, sounds, colours, patterns. We're both sensing this stuff, we are intuiting this stuff, we are experiencing it by merging with it. We become part of the music. We feel the music inside of us. We become part of that texture until we can't feel the separateness of ourselves and that texture. We're wrapped up in that texture. We experience the colours, but we move through the colours, and the colours feel like they're moving through us. We meet, we encounter people, but we experience them like a kind of living music, like this music of beingness that has a different shape, in a sense, each one. And their shape changes how we experience it. So it's not yet a world of self and other. It's a world of self in other and other in self. And it's not a world of imitating. It's a world of merging in order to know something as the basic sensory and emotional experience of what we're merging with. Repertoire, the dictionaries, in those connections in the brain that have not yet been made. And as such, because we haven't got all those connections made, there's nothing to filter what's coming in. And so we get overwhelmed, and we contract, and we scream, and we look away, and we, cry, or we space out, or we dissociate, or however we manage that, which I guess you could say is a bit autistic, and therefore we all have this autistic response to the world. And some people continue to have that, and others make enough connections in their brain that they begin to filter what's coming in, and they thereby cut down on a large amount of what's coming in, and they build their repertoires so that everything that's coming in progressively is coming in with meaning and it's manageable, and then we call those people less autistic.
Maybe autistics, neurodivergent folks should be instead be called the still merged people, because we have never quite lost that sense of being able to merge. Like the so-called predominant neurotype, the so-called normal people. Those that were totally domesticated by the system we live in. Neurodivergent folk, autistics, however, never fully were able to do that in the same way. And that's being labeled as a disorder. So I'm asking, who is actually the disordered?
The bigger problem is we don't really understand mental illness. What the hell is mental illness? I just read a really good book by Gabor Mate, who goes from like A to Z about childhood trauma and our societal problems that contribute to
the myths of normal, trauma, illness, and healing in a toxic culture. How our society breeds disease and the pathway to health and healing.
I think most people, neuroscientists, a lot of, not psychiatrists, but we don't like labels. We don't like the DSM, like especially neuroscience. It doesn't make any sense. All you're doing is clustering symptoms and calling it a disorder. It's useful, but it's not explanatory. So I think we need more people like him, or just, more fields coming together to look at what are the issues. And they're not going to be individual, like what everyone's so focused on, what are the brain mechanisms? But we do need to kind of, pull out and be like, what are the societal mechanisms? How is our society not supporting? Or it's a really big question.
Because when we lose the sense of sensing, there's so little left. Such a big part of us that is still with us all the time, shut down. And I think that is, in general, actually traumatic. It has been hidden in the unconscious.
I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I studied psychopathic traits actually initially, and I was doing digital health research, and I had this existential crisis where everything just started falling apart. And I was very strictly scientific materialist, anti-spirituality, anti-religion before all of this, and then until crisis comes knocking on your door. And in this time of crisis, I just got curious about it and started reading and interviewing people in the space, and just started opening my mind. And it was through those interviews actually that somebody had mentioned to me I should look at psychedelics because they're really interesting, and that sometimes people, when they take psychedelics, could have transpersonal experiences or paranormal phenomena can happen. And I was super unfamiliar with psychedelics. I had never even thought about them, like really. And then I dove into that literature, and my mind was blown, and I was so impressed with the science. I had no idea that it was like that. So then I started experimenting there and found how healing they were, and that what the person had told me was true, that there's all these really interesting things that happen on psychedelics, but not just psychedelics, right? In any kind of altered state. So I just have this interest in how all of these things intersect, because they're all kind of their own separate fields. And of course, I'm a neuroscientist, so I'm interested in how brain and mind and all of that plays together.
I love that.
To me, it's just how this is not going to be a technical neuroscientific definition, but to me, it's how you make sense of the world around you, which is reality, right? And our brains actually have a lot of ways to do this, to double check, right? The sensory information that's coming in, our brain's constantly trying to make sense of it. And we have frameworks for that we've picked up along the way from, child development all through our entire lives. So it's taking the information that is coming in and comparing it to that framework. And ontological shock to me is when something along that pathway gets disrupted. Either what's coming in doesn't match the framework, or suddenly the framework is shifting. So that's how I think of it.
It seems like an easy definition here.
Super easy.
The state of being forced to question one's worldview. And that seems like it's inherent in medium to high dose psychedelic sessions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, but there's a big difference between the way someone can experience those. There's a very wide range of experiences that accompany how people apprehend what happens to them. And some people, it seems to come in and they are able to do this kind of reframing. It's okay with them. There's something that's not so rigid about the way their set of assumptions or their personalities are structured. And other people, it comes across as an enormous cataclysmic experience in which the world itself and everything they held true and imagined and thought about and experienced is exploded in the course of one session. And so the shock would be more prevalent among that latter group. There seems to be a big difference, although, I mean, it's true that people who've had plenty of experiences, I think as Mona has described, and are accepting of them, can still have that experience where yet again something even more profound or extreme comes to pass that they haven't experienced previously in those ways.
I could speak to that a little too. So outside of the context of psychedelics, but for me personally, the spiritual awakening or encountering paranormal experiences or whatever, things that according to our Western mainstream scientific culture shouldn't be true when they are true. When I came up against that, it was so threatening to my identity as a scientist, as a very serious scientist. And that's kind of what I was looking at through the whole process. So what Eric saying, it makes so much sense. Like for me, it was so important for me to protect my identity, and maybe for somebody was a little more evolved or had done a little more self-work on themselves, it's less threatening to them. It's easier to accept. And for me, I feel like that's true now that I've gone through it. So I think it kind of depends, I don't know where you are in your, I don't want to say development, but just in your path, So, and then one more thing to add to that is when I went further to actually experience these different realities with psychedelics, it was a whole new layer, a whole new ontological shock of, even though I logically, rationally understood that there might be other realities, or let's say I even believed in some of it, experiencing it is a whole different thing, right? And then that's a whole new kind of shock to incorporate. And shock is a strong word, but it's an encounter, I guess.
But we can get it back with psychedelics. Bring it online. So it will guide us, but in a conscious way. So for example, with the Amanita, if you take very large doses, usually you are knocked out and you go to places, but you don't remember that because it happens in the unconscious while you sleep, and maybe your body may trash around and stuff. But if you take smaller doses and you stay conscious, as I am right now, I'm fully conscious, but the brain chatter, the interpreting, is tuned down. So I compare it to a radio. You have to tune in, right, to get the proper sound. Otherwise, it's just garbage. You don't hear anything proper. But if you fine tune into it, you can clearly hear. So I compare Amanita in minor doses to that, because then you can hear, you can listen to it, you get insights, you get ideas, and they are not coming from your ego mind. It is a quite different way of perception. They are thoughts, but they have a different flavor. Things you might never have thought of or seen in that way. But you keep that with you because it happens in a conscious way. You are awake. And if you take large doses, well, stuff might be downloaded to you. But you really can't access it right away.
But it's unknown knowing, because it came in without the filtering and it was being processed back there in that pre-conscious state, not in the conscious state, not in mind, what we know of as conscious mind. The pre-conscious state is really more, I guess, body. It's more like body brain rather than mind. And so then if we can progressively talk about how we move out of this state of mergence, this state of beingness, this state of sensing, this place of unknown knowing, this my world, what is our next stage, if you like. And our next stage is really that we move into being a sensory being in interaction with the external world. We're taking our my world and we're playing with the external world and taking this back and forth into our own world. And we're progressively building a society where we pathologize anybody who's not, straight up for the cladding by the time they're 2 or 3 years old. But that is, in my opinion, a huge ignorance of the process, of the natural process of how human beings mature from their my world into the external world, into the world of mind, and then, if necessary and where necessary, that world of cladding and ego. So let's talk about the external world. When I moved out of this place of purely pattern, theme and feel, when I was moving out of a place of merging and self in others and others in self, where to know something, you resonated with it and you felt it within you. And I moved out of this into a place where part of me was now incarnated, if you like, quite in the body. And so there was beginning to be, if you like, this separateness between the my world and the external world, a dialogue, an interplay, and a transition, but a progressive separateness. And this meant I would get up inside of the tree. I didn't stand outside the tree. I didn't yet have enough of that, self and other separateness to stand outside of the tree and experience the tree. I got inside the tree to feel as the tree and putting my face into, the blossoms and of this lemon tree and the buzz of the bees around me and the warmth of the sky and the light that was coming through these shaded green leaves.
The Mazateks still live with an attitude that the world is magical and sacred. The magic of the mushroom is so vast and complex that no amount of research can hope to capture and explain all its elements. It deals with the position of man versus the cosmos, the mystery of life and death, the existence of the spirit. The mushroom is the catalyst that brings about the meeting between the microcosm and the macrocosm. There is nirvana, a balanced state of holiness, contemplation, and light. God is in the river, the sun, the woods, the songbirds, the sunset, in childhood, in the heart. Why do we forget that in childhood we are closer to God? In this materialistic civilization, we have learned to underrate the wisdom of Maria Sabina. We have lost any notion of sacredness. We have sacrificed the most precious spiritual treasures in exchange for materialistic well-being. The atheistic science has brought man to the brink of destruction with nuclear arsenals and merciless wars. It is sad that the truly wise must live away from those who need them most, from those who live under the thumb of the destructive power of civilization. The day man forgot God and pretended to replace him in the universe, man lost his way and himself. It is a world of the blind, leading the blind, and falling into the abyss. I have found those in the field to be completely taken over by materialism and Marxism. They refuse to acknowledge the world of magic and the sacred element in all of us. Scientists, they are more lost than the rest of us. They are sure that God doesn't exist. I saw those who came to confirm the reality of the mushrooms. This is something sacred, and they could not see.
I think they're doing an abysmal job. And I think they are treating this very much in the tradition of we are doing the research necessary to get a drug approved by the FDA, and we're going to do so that we can have another pill to prescribe. And it is not accounting for, even though people have framed the results that when people have the spiritual awakening, the depression is usually much more effectively treated, blah, blah, blah. But they're not really coping with what happens the day after somebody leaves the study session, goes back to London, wherever, and then tries to function in their daily lives with, number one, very importantly, that they don't stress enough, is not having the support. When you go through the experience, you have a lot of support. You leave, you go back. Those guys are not there. If you're lucky, they'll talk to you on the phone. If you're not lucky, they won't. So you're left kind of on the street with your ontological shock and your need for, what shall I say, verification and someone to bounce this experience off of. And this is what happened. And I think they're not being responsible about it.
Yeah.
The more I think about it, especially as the drug companies get involved, really. Like in France, a very large drug company is running the biggest study now at the big mental hospital in Paris. They basically bought that situation and...
Like a Compass or something?
Yes, Compass
yeah.
Explicitly.
Yeah, they've got enough cash to do that for sure.
St. Anne's, the gentleman who is the head psychiatrist there is always very eager to be involved with pharmaceutical companies, and he was very happy when the ketamine boys were paying him to prescribe ketamine for depression, and he was approached, and that was it, off and running. So,
Mona, how about yourself? Like, where's the room for improvement here? Or what are the biggest errors in terms of lack of preparation for studies?
I mean, I don't know what they are doing, but I started wondering about this and kind of musing on it after that. I had a really powerful 5-MeO-DMT experience where, even though I was really well prepared for it, I came out, like I said, like it's one thing to know what to expect to experience, but it's another thing to experience it. And when I came out, this is my experience, I think, and I'm just one person, but part of the problem is that you don't have, as we all know, we talk about this all the time, you don't have the language to even describe kind of what the problem is, right? And you don't even know if there's a problem at first. At first, when I came out of the experience, my ego was like, no, we're fine, everything's fine. We are fine. And I couldn't, if someone had asked me, which people were asking me, I was like, it was interesting. Like, it was great. I'm processing it. I'm working through it. It's good. But I couldn't, there was no language to explain like what I was experiencing, like how shocking it was to have become the entire universe and to be back at my computer answering emails. Like, if someone had asked me, how do you feel? Like, I didn't have any words. I didn't have language. And even with all the reading and research I had done, there was no framework of understanding and no language to communicate it. And so it took me a really long time to understand, is there a problem here? Or do I need to communicate with someone? It kind of, I didn't even know how to deal with it. And I had support afterward. But like I said, you could have support. And if you don't have the language and the capability of expressing, that relational aspect, if I can't connect with another person, they can't help me. And so there's multiple, I think, steps. Like, there's you connecting with your feeling. There's external frameworks and language maybe you could provide, or other people's stories. Maybe that, if whatever your external support is, kind of, you don't want them to prime you with words or experiences, but, in some way help facilitate, I don't know, like, being in relationship with the experience in a better way, if that makes sense. I don't know.
So I come from the holotropic graph world, and all of these experiences are done in groups, which isn't necessarily the best case scenario for people with really acute problems. But I do wonder how something like a group therapy could be integrated here in a long-term format to help people get their shit together in the next couple months.
Yeah.
Right? Because this, the next 2 weeks are hard, or it could be longer.
Yeah, I agree. And
I think the psychosocial level is far more important, actually.
Help me out.
Because we don't have the tools to acknowledge this deep spiritual, emotional thing that happens at the level of, like, when you read Greek myths, for instance, and you actually read what they actually say, and or Hindu mythology. I mean, that stuff, we see it and go, oh, how, well, some people say, oh, how quaint or whatever. But there are traditions that actually take on board its meaning in a way in which we're not trivializing, we're not being afraid of. And we, as Westerners, are profoundly unequipped. We've annihilated that ability from our history, our etymology, and so when it does occur, we have no tools, none. And regardless of what's going on in the brain, it's what's going on in us,
They talked about the mushrooms, to all and sundry. There was nothing they would stoop to. According to them, the mushrooms were not an entity, it was a drug that makes your mind hallucinate. The mushrooms are something greater. But they did not know the meaning of respect. Seen it through the Mazatec's eyes. To them, the arrival of strange and exotic visitors who had no regard for the occult knowledge and skill conferred by the mushrooms. It was a disaster. It was a social and spiritual pollution. The mushrooms had become a commodity with a price. The mushrooms are divine. He was hidden in the mountains and knew more about me than myself. I learned it all from the mushrooms. Once in a trip, I entered the trunk of the tree of wisdom to its deepest level, and I found all the answers. The great wise one asked me what sort of knowledge I desired, And I said, all. And she asked, will your mind be ready? I said, I will try. And the great wise one gave this knowledge, which is all buried deep in these lands.